Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report. After a dramatic 45 days, the 2019 legislative session has adjourned. What bills stalled? Which ones might see a special session? And what major issues remain unresolved? After months of speculation over a historic surplus, how was the money finally spent? Who were the winners? Who were the losers? How did the debate over tax reform ultimately define the session? And which significant social issues dominated the headlines? Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Glen Mills, anchor with ABC4 Utah, Lisa Riley Roche, political reporter with the Deseret News, and Ben Winslow, reporter with Fox 13 News. So glad to have you all here today, particularly after the late night. We're all on the Hill.
We're all still trying to wake up.
Yeah, yes, we are. The session ended last night. We're all there to the very end. And I want to talk about a couple of the bills, but also I want to start a little bit, Ben, with you. All right. I noticed the shirt. The press is not the enemy. It was so nice to you on the Hill this year. And you were talking in these back rooms with a lot of these legislators. I'm curious what the tone of the session was. Is this different than what you've seen in years past?
It is. It was all over the place. I mean, we started with this bang with Medicaid expansion and dealing with Proposition 3. Right after the special session, dealing with medical cannabis, Proposition 2. Then it just started lurching forward. Then we had the big tax bill, and then we didn't have the big tax bill. And then it all just kind of ended.
It did, just like that.
That's actually a really good synopsis there. I think with the new leadership in place that we had two very experienced, very policy-oriented leaders in Stuart Adams as Senate President and Brad Wilson as House Speaker. I think we thought the whole session was going to go along like the Medicaid expansion limitation went, right? They came out with an idea, they pushed it, they got it through, the governor signed it the day it passed, and then they started on tax reform, and then the wheels came off. There was friction between the two leaders that led to a budget impasse. At one point, it looked like there'd be nothing beyond what they call a base budget, basically a bare bones minimum budget just to get the state through without any kind of funding for growth or anything, any other new needs. That was fixed, kind of, and now we're going into a task force on tax reform, which is always an interesting proposition.
I think there was some getting used to each other and their different leadership styles as well. As you mentioned, there were times where it appeared the House was here, the Senate was here, and they were never going to come together. To their credit, though, for every one of those big issues, they came together in the middle in almost a lot of those cases, and were able to move forward. With the beer bill would be one example, the stronger beer bill. The budget, very skinny budget coming from the House and different ideas from the Senate. But that was really a tone that stuck out to me, is just how different they were on different sides of the aisle. And you know, you have Republicans dominating both chambers, but they were so far apart on some issues before they were able to come together. And then another thing I'll point out as far as the tone, they really got through some huge issues early. On the final day, this just doesn't happen. We're kind of sitting there saying, what are we covering today on this final day? Because they hit all the big ones: abortion, hate crimes, the Medicaid expansion. They got it out of the way before the final day.
I'm not so sure they were so far apart philosophically. And that's where I go back to the two personalities leading the House and the Senate. They're both very similar in their views on fiscally conservative budget, the importance of emphasizing policy over maybe what might look good politically. So I think, at least I was very surprised that the House came out with such a radical idea in terms of, you mentioned it, the skinny budget. It seemed more like that was a little personality friction rather than a real policy difference in the two. They both want tax reform. They both want a structurally sound budget. As we all know, the general fund isn't growing as fast as the income tax collections, and that creates problems for everything in the budget outside of education.
I will say I do think there are some philosophical differences in how to go about tax reform, though. I believe that tax reform bill did not have the votes, from what I've heard, in the Senate to get through where it did in the House. So I do believe you're right. You know, the conservative value, moving forward, conservatively, fiscally responsible. However, the way to get there, I think there were some differences there.
Ben, can we talk about how we get there? Because it seems like we did get to a point in the session where both sides were pretty entrenched. These two budgets, right? They're going the skinny budget and the other budget.
The low carb, the lean budget versus the robust or Rubenesque budget.
We heard all of those on the Hill. But one of the things that seemed to break this logjam was this idea of this task force. What's going to happen with this task force? What do you see happening up through probably August?
Well, as we saw on the Hill, once that tax reform bill was dropped, there was a lot of people who had a lot of concerns about this. People who were self-employed, people who have small businesses, who suddenly found themselves going, how am I going to implement a sales tax for the services that they provide? That there was a lot of people who had just a general visceral panic of, well, how does this affect me? What am I going to do? And it seems like what the state's going to have to do, or what the legislature is going to have to do, is go on sort of a charm offensive and talk to people about why this is good policy. Why telling a piano teacher, why telling a plumber, why telling a hairstylist you're going to have to implement a sales tax on service if that's what they decide to do. There's other tax plans that are being talked about, upping the sales tax on food, property tax changes, shifts maybe even in income tax or proposed constitutional amendments there. They're going to have to go around the state and explain to people why this is a good idea.
Yeah, Lisa, is this what they were missing when they brought this up, this charm offensive? I mean, people were just really looking in their own pocketbook, right? And they said, I'm opposed maybe because of that, really not getting to these issues of structural deficits between income tax and sales tax.
Well, that's part of the problem with this issue is, number one, unlike Medicaid expansion, which the version that lawmakers settled on to replace Proposition 3 was very similar to what they passed last year. And so they already debated and dealt with that as lawmakers. But with tax reform, it's a very complicated, very difficult issue to understand. And you know, Glenn, to your point about the trouble with getting votes in the Senate, the issue in the Senate wasn't over whether or not to tax services. It was this really wonky piece of that, which was about what they call tax pyramiding, and that's a tax on a tax on a tax. For example, if you're a lawyer and you go out because you're handling a big case, you hire a couple paralegals, and those paralegals who are contract employees, you're paying sales tax on their services. The bill they're giving you has all of the taxes they've paid and all the services they've contracted for. And that's something the legislature has really, to their credit, tried to avoid. On business inputs, for example, a lot of the sales tax exemptions that would have been kept in place under this bill dealt with making sure that if you make a widget, you're not paying taxes on all the pieces that go into that widget. With that level of complexity, just internally in the legislature, for the public to kind of step up and try to understand, okay, wait a minute, you're taxing services, and wait a minute, what is pyramiding? It's a lot to take on for everybody. And by going to this task force, I think there's a real possibility we're going to just kind of reopen everything, as Ben was saying, with restoring the sales tax on food, which was a backup plan the Senate had, and property tax and everything else. And so who knows where we're...
Last word on this, Glenn.
We heard the governor talk yesterday about how the onus is on them now to educate the public about how this is going to impact them. I don't know how you're going to send a message to the business community, hey, look, you've never had to pay taxes on this area or this area, and all of a sudden you're going to have to, and make that look good and appealing to them. businesses really came out in strong opposition to this. We heard the Utah Taxpayers Association say, you know, to move forward with the business-to-business tax, taxing inputs would step our state back decades from the progress that we have made. So that's going to be a tough sell for lawmakers as they do go around the state. But I've also heard some movement say, all right, maybe we do need to back off inputs, take a closer look at what is a service, how do you define it. So the conversation has happened, and you know, business owners deserve credit for coming out, speaking out, and getting it to the point where we're going to push this off into the interim.
Yeah, we'll watch it closely up and through August. This session may last for a little while. All right, Ben, let's start with a couple of these bills. Record number, 573 bills.
573 bills passed. They broke the record. 1,300 proposed, or at least sought. So yeah, they were busy.
They were busy, and they still left a little bit early last night.
We left an hour early.
Once we passed the bill to make the noble Gila monster the state reptile, we're done. There's nothing more to do.
You spotted a big, important bill this session. That's a good one. Let's talk about a couple others that were more controversial, but that got kind of new life towards the end. Can we start with you on hate crimes?
Hate crimes was big.
Yeah. So tell us what happened with this bill that finally got it through, and what some of the pieces were.
After years and 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 years, it finally got through. Senator Thatcher. Yeah, Senator Thatcher, I think, just hounded and pestered the legislature to finally pass it. And after picking up the torch from Senator Urquhart and then going back before that, there was a lot of categories added to win over opponents, where it was particularly normally in other states, there was things like, of course, the race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity. Then there was added things like matriculation. There was things like homelessness, marital status. And then at the last minute, to win over even more opponents who might otherwise not vote for this, political expression was added in. Not political belief, but political expression, because they believe that is more legally defensible.
Okay. So. Lisa, you're watching this closely. So a couple of those last-minute additions made some people kind of worried that this was watering this down a little bit, or some worried about some of the kinds of speech might be caught up in this. But why exactly did they finally go along in the end when we thought that maybe this was dead?
Well, I think there was, you mean why did the legislature go along with this? Yeah. It was a really interesting dynamic. This started in the Senate with Senator Thatcher. And actually, some of my colleagues did a story interviewing Senator Thatcher where he complained about not getting support within the Senate Republican caucus. The caucus wanted at least half their membership to be willing to support the bill before they were going to let it out. And I think that did the trick. Questions were asked, and that kind of public pressure made at least Senate Republican leadership back that bill. A few Republican senators still opposed it, but it got the support it needed and the momentum it needed. And then, as Ben was saying, when concerns were raised about someone being targeted because they wear a MAGA hat, Make America Great Again, supporting President Trump's slogan, and get targeted for some kind of victimization, they wanted to make sure that those folks were protected as well. And Thatcher initially resisted, but went along with it, got it through.
But then there was also some recent incidents in Utah that did drive this, and it also highlighted the powerlessness of local prosecutors to deal with this. The tire shop attack on 3 Latino men, the feds had to step in and deal with that. And then you had the attack on the man with the cell phone, and people saw that, and it was a visual representation of what prosecutors had said would be arguably a hate crime. But they also said, we can't do anything about this. We can't seek this penalty enhancement locally. And I think that also, at least in the public's mind, drove maybe why it should be considered by the legislature.
Just a couple of additional points on that. When that passed, I talked with Salt Lake County District Attorney Sim Gill, who's been a huge supporter of this bill, trying to get it pushed through. It brought him to tears. That's how emotional this whole issue was. Second, I think we need to mention the fact that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints noted that they would not oppose this bill this time around. We all remember how furious Senator Urquhart was, the last time around a couple of years ago. He blamed the church for getting in the way and stopping that bill. And then third, we may not have seen the end of the protected categories. There may be more added. Senator Thatcher left that open because on the House or the Senate floor debate, we heard people saying, well, you know, maybe we need to add teachers. Maybe we need to add rural farmers was one. So they may continue to look at that and expand that list down the road as well.
Okay, I'll watch that closely. Let's blaze through a couple of these other bills I want to get to. Ben, the beer bill came back.
Okay. Why are you going to Ben on that one?
So I saw you some great stories on this. So where do we end up?
We ended up at a significant change. Not since Prohibition has alcohol gone up in Utah, alcohol content. We went from 3.2, the bill proposed, to 4.8 alcohol by weight. We ended up at 4.0, which mega beer makers say that they can live with because it's their natural recipe. So what it ultimately means for consumers is that up to 88% of the product will stay on the shelves. Maverick and other grocery stores had said, we're losing product as a result of other states dumping 3.2 beer to go to heavier brews. That leaves Utah alone. Utah is still also unique in this. We are the only state with this new level, but the mega brewers think that they can make this work. Obviously, they don't want to lose any market share, product share in Utah. So this is where they ended up at. The governor told me that he is likely to sign it because he believes it's a good compromise.
This is another example of where the House and Senate were on different pages. The 4.8 bill passed the Senate, if I remember right, 27-2. It went to a House committee, the HHS committee. We were in that committee, and it was fiery. Probably one of the more
it was tense.
spirited committees I've seen. Senator Stevenson knew it went there to die there. He was not happy about that. He made it clear it did die there. However, they came together on this compromise and literally met in the middle.
It is incredibly significant to see that this change made. I think it helped that Senator Stevenson is also the Senate Budget Chairman.
Right.
And as you say, Glenn, he really did not give up. He just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. So there were folks there up on the Hill who thought this was the first step to opening up the state to selling wine and other
Well, that was the ballot initiative
products.
threat. That was the other. This was the carrot. There was the stick of a ballot initiative in 2020 where you would have full-strength beer, and the talk was, hey, what the heck? Let's just throw in wine in grocery stores just for fun.
And you know, that's there were also concerns raised about having higher alcohol content beer in these grocery and convenience stores being much more available to underage drinkers because perhaps they're not sold as carefully as they are in the state liquor store system. But it got through.
Okay, right before I leave this one, Glenn, this point was good because on the Hill, people were saying you can do this either on your own volition or we'll do an initiative.
Yeah.
That had an impact?
Absolutely. We've seen the impact that it had just this last year. You know, 3 ballot initiatives passing through, but we also saw the legislature respond to that and significantly change the ballot initiative process. We're going to now see ballot initiatives, the implementation date extended to go so that the next legislature can always have an opportunity to take a look and amend it. We saw some tinkering with the signature gathering process. Big changes made to the ballot initiative process.
Let's talk about this for a minute, Lisa. We have at least 4 bills impacting the initiative process, everywhere from delaying the implementation until after a session goes to how we account for the signatures as they come on board.
It's an interesting message to voters, isn't it? At the same time that as previously pointed out, lawmakers had already taken action to change Proposition 2, the medical marijuana initiative that passed. They took action to change Medicaid expansion, also passed by voters. The third initiative that was passed by voters dealing with an independent redistricting commission. There were talks this session to try to get something through on that, but because that commission would not take place until after the 2020 census, they've got time to deal with it next session, and we've been told that that will happen. So, you know, voters made it clear, I think last November, what they had expected to see from lawmakers, and since they didn't get it, they thought they were doing it themselves. Some of that was changed, and more of it will be, and now it's going to be harder for them to send that kind of message.
Yeah, I think that's true. Okay, Ben, the inland port. We've been reading about this so much in the news, this interesting bill that allows counties, cities outside of the designated space to join. Describe what that is and why this is so political.
It's a hub and spoke model, and I think we're all still trying to figure out exactly how this is going to work. But essentially also it lets other communities get a stake or get a slice of this pie. This has been described as the biggest economic development project since Brigham Young entered the Salt Lake Valley. This is going to be a massive import-export center that clears customs very quickly. It's going to be big. So there's a lot of interests in this. Salt Lake City, it takes up a large chunk of Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City wants its say in this. And in fact, with this bill that just went through, it would have, at least one of the versions of it, would have blocked city administrations from suing over anything without permission of the city council. Salt Lake City Mayor Jackie Biskupski filed a lawsuit, beating the buzzer on that, challenging the constitutionality of the inland port and its makeup and how it all goes. We'll see where that plays out in the courts. The language, though, was stripped out at the last minute in that. This is going to be a big project that I think they're laying the groundwork for, and we'll just have to see how this plays out.
Go ahead, Glenn.
Well, I was just going to say, once again, it brings the spotlight on Salt Lake City, where the mayor is not coming to the table and working with the bill sponsor while the city council is, and it has the two pitted against each other again. The city council already tried to say the mayor cannot sue without our approval, but she's moving forward because she believes she has the authority to do that.
Is there anything else to why she did this, Lisa? I mean, there's got to be some politics in this besides just the loss.
There's always politics, right? What I found really interesting about this idea of a hub and spoke model is it kind of dilutes the benefits Salt Lake City would get from this inland port, right? So I'd heard some talk on the Hill, I don't know how serious it was, that if Salt Lake City keeps fighting this, maybe we just move the inland port somewhere else because, yeah, it's close to the airport out there, but there are other places that have rail lines and airports, and maybe it could just go somewhere else. The legislature is really invested in this concept of an inland port, and if there continues to be friction with Salt Lake, maybe hub and spoke becomes less hub and more spoke.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah, that's the message we heard from this bill, is other counties, specifically rural counties, saying, hey, we want a piece of that pie.
Yeah, for the last couple of seconds, Ben, so lawsuits are already in the works on the abortion bill in Utah, which has moved no abortions after 18 weeks, essentially, is the bill. And that puts us at odds with some of the other states, that have already lost these kind of lawsuits. What's happening next? Who's already claiming they're going to go after this?
Supporters of these bills view this as a possible vehicle to the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade. That looks to be where it's going, and that looks to be some of the motivation behind this. We'll see what the courts say about this, but that litigation is all but assured.
And Lisa, that's what the governor talked about also, right? Is we'll dedicate some money to this to fight it.
The governor seems to think that, along with a lot of other people who consider themselves pro-life and want to see Roe versus Wade overturned, seem to think that we're in a position now with the changes in the courts, the makeup of the U.S. Supreme Court on down, that it might be time for this to be overturned. There might be a real opportunity there. Of course, some of us have been covering politics long enough in this state to know that argument's been made before, and it hasn't been successful. But we'll see.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your insights today. Very informative. Well, that's it for the Hinckley Report. KUED is in the last days of its fund drive. Your generous support makes programs like the Hinckley Report possible. Please take a moment to make a donation in support of the programs that you rely on. I'm Jason Perry. Thank you, and good night.